Alrighty, welcome everyone to another exciting edition of American Studies 395, and welcome to our first lecture since the midterm project. With this lecture, we're starting to develop lecture content that will come back to haunt you on a final exam. So in the lectures in the second half of the class, we are developing content that's fair game for the final exam. In our first lecture after the midterm project, here we're going to talk about the place of California in one key development in American history after World War II, in the late 20th century, the modern civil rights movement. And this is a chance for us to engage again in some of the big themes of the class, namely the place of California in the larger history of the United States. And we'll see here evidence of, once again, California in the vanguard, meaning that California is ahead of larger trends that will come to define the United States in this period, and in particular in regards to civil rights. We've seen that earlier in the class, how California was in the vanguard of the progressive movement in the early 20th century, how California in many ways was in the vanguard in some of the changes during the Great Depression as ideas developed here that would eventually lead to federal national programs like Social Security. So in many previous lectures, we've talked about the way in which California is in the forefront of major political trends. Certainly what happens in California culturally comes to influence the whole of the nation, whether it's Hollywood or Disneyland. Here today, we'll be able to see that now in relation to the story of the modern civil rights movement. We'll see here how California was in the vanguard of that key national change after World War II. But also this is a chance in this lecture for us to engage in another key theme in this class, the issue of who's a Californian. We have seen that as contested in previous lectures. We have seen that as in debate, in contest, and we'll see that here once again when the modern civil rights movement, active here in California in the late 20th century, challenged the exclusionary efforts that had foreclosed a lot of inclusion for people who are here within California but weren't recognized as members of the California community. A good example of California in the forefront of civil rights is the California State Supreme Court case, Mendez versus Westminster, that would ultimately desegregate California public schools years before the Brown v. Board of Education ruling would do so nationwide. This case, Mendez versus Westminster, is a product of civil rights advocacy by Latinos who were objecting to the way in which they were subject to segregation in California public schools. LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, was challenging a number of laws, strictures in California that we saw develop in the early 20th century that segregated people of color, excluded them from being recognized as part of the public, part of the California community. And so LULAC, among other groups, were seeking to challenge school segregation in court. The specifics of the case, Mendez versus Westminster, are very intriguing because it involved a Latino family, the Mendez family, who were living on land that was owned by a Japanese American family in the city of Westminster in Orange County, not too far from Cal State Fullerton. And this Latino family, the Mendez family, was taking care of this land. They were stewards of this land, while the Japanese American family that owned it were detained in internment camps. This was a strategy that many Japanese American landowners employed, where they wanted to safeguard their land, their possessions, while they were held indefinitely in the internment camp. They often hired people to look after their farms and homes. And that was the case here, that the Mendez family came to live in Westminster because they were stewards of a farm owned by Japanese Americans. So the story behind the landmark Mendez versus Westminster case is about two excluded groups, two marginalized groups, two groups here in California who were not seen as full and equal members of the California community. The Japanese Americans, who were subject to internment, and the Mendez family as representative of Latinos who were segregated in public education. Here in California in the 1940s and for decades prior, Californian public schools were segregated so that the Mendez family, their children, could not attend the closest public school in Westminster, in Orange County, because it was closed to them. It was for whites only. And so this case brought to the California State Supreme Court through the advocacy efforts of LULAC and other Latino civil rights organizations. This Supreme Court case ultimately in 1946 would rule that segregation in Westminster, in all California public schools, was unconstitutional based on the California state constitution. So this was a landmark event. It represents how 8 years before the Brown v. Board of Education ruling that would desegregate public schools nationwide, here in California, there was this California State Supreme Court ruling that would desegregate public schools in California, ordering that you could no longer have white-only schools that excluded African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, Asian Americans. Chief Justice of the California State Supreme Court, among the justices who ruled accordingly in the landmark Mendez versus Westminster case, was Earl Warren. And Earl Warren would go on to be appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court. He would go from the Chief Justice of the California State Supreme Court to the U.S. Supreme Court and be one of the justices who 8 years later would vote to desegregate public schools nationwide in the landmark Brown v. Board of Education ruling. So there is a very direct connection between the Mendez ruling here in California in 1946 and the Brown v. Board of Education ruling 8 years later on a U.S. level, U.S. Supreme Court level, that would desegregate public schools nationwide. Earl Warren would go on to be the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court after previously being the California State Supreme Court Justice who helped rule in the Mendez ruling to desegregate public schools in Orange County and across California. So here's further evidence of how what happened in California would later shape and influence the whole of the nation, how California was in the forefront, in the vanguard of civil rights in this period. Now, as we talked about in previous lectures, World War II was a boom time here in California. The California economy boomed during World War II, with California being a key center of wartime production. And with it came another wave of what's known as the Great Migration. This exodus of African Americans out of the South to northern cities and also to Los Angeles and the West Coast, particularly in World War II. So, as we've talked about in previous lectures, the demography of California changes in World War II. We become much more diverse and heterogeneous with the Bracero program, this large influx of Latinos who are actively recruited to work in agriculture during World War II, and with the large increase of African Americans who come to this state to either serve in the war effort or to work in the wartime economy. So there's this major influx of African Americans during World War II, but they come to a California that, as we learned about in previous lectures, in the Progressive era, had established laws that were very exclusionary. They came to a California where, prior to Mendez, public schools were segregated. They came to a California where residential segregation was rigorously enforced, meaning that African Americans could only rent or buy homes in certain parts of California cities like Los Angeles. They faced racial covenants where homeowners, in their deeds, in the deeds that they held for their homes, it was written into those deeds that they could not sell or rent their homes to African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, Asian Americans, a number of religious minorities as well, Jews and Catholics. So here's this large influx of African Americans. They're coming out here to sacrifice and serve in World War II in a variety of ways, either directly in the military or in the wartime economy. But they're coming to a California where they face segregation, discrimination, where they face residential segregation, where they're forbidden to live in certain parts of California cities. We saw in film noir, in Disneyland, in lectures just before the midterm project, how there's this process of white flight going on in Southern California in particular in World War II and the post-World War II era. We're faced with this influx of racial minorities. Whites flee to the suburbs, and the suburbs became bastions of whiteness through not just a revulsion among whites to the prospects of living in cities side by side with racial minorities, but also through law. Laws were passed that effectively barred racial and religious minorities from living in suburban communities. So African Americans found themselves facing a number of strictures and laws that clearly marked them as unequal members of California society, where they could not live, learn where they pleased, facing segregation in public schools, in universities, in residential areas. But as there's this tension, this conflict between a vision of California and the reality of California, as there's this large influx of racial minorities and they're confronting these exclusionary practices, there's an effort to dismantle them. And that begins here in California in the late 50s, early 60s, before such legislation will manifest on a nationwide level. In 1959, the California State Legislature passed a Civil Rights Act that began to dismantle the strictures and laws that discriminate based on race. And the 1959 Act opened up employment opportunities to African Americans, to Native Americans, to Latinos and Asian Americans by stipulating you could not discriminate based on race in employment, in hiring, in private businesses. You can have a sign that says we don't serve blacks at this cafe or department store. So years before the 1964 Civil Rights Act that will establish such legislation on a nationwide level, 5 years prior to that, 1959, the California State Legislature was pursuing the slow dismantling of Jim Crow segregation here in California. Another key achievement in this vein was in 1963 when the Rumford Act was passed by the California State Legislature, also demonstrative of civil rights advances here in California in this post-World War II period. Rumford Act specifically targeted segregation, discrimination in residential laws. It forbid residential discrimination based on race. You could no longer have covenants written into deeds that say you can't rent or sell this home to an African American, a Latino, Asian American. You as a landlord can no longer say I don't rent to racial minorities. This was designed to really open up a key part of the California dream to racial minorities. As we talked about in previous lectures, in the post-World War II period, a house in the suburbs is the ideal. It's celebrated in American culture and society, whether it's the saccharine sitcoms, whether it's the imagery surrounding Disneyland. Overall, in the post-World War II period, the epitome of the American dream is that house in the suburbs in a safe neighborhood with tree-lined streets and good schools. And the Rumford Act was designed to make that California dream, which is increasingly the American dream in the post-World War II period, available to racial minorities. So here again, well before on a nationwide level, you'll get the Civil Rights Act of 1964, later the Fair Housing Act of the late 1960s. You have here in California the Rumford Act, which is designed to, one, dismantle residential segregation based on race, a key civil rights achievement, but moreover, open up the key tangible marker of being a Californian, enjoying the California dream to racial minorities, namely those houses in the suburbs, to end the period where, after World War II, the suburbs of California were for whites and whites only. However, because who is a Californian, who is entitled to the California dream, is a contested, debated element of modern California history, there would be a backlash to the Rumford Act in Prop 14. We talked earlier in the class in our lecture on the Progressive Era how one of the developments in the Progressive Era was to establish a proposition process by which California voters could directly influence and amend the California state constitution through popular vote, or overturn laws that had been passed by the California state legislature. This was in line with progressive era notions of empowering the people, reform where the California population could directly influence law through the will of the people. And so we've seen earlier that process develop. And I noted in our lecture on the Progressive Era that so much of California history can be seen in this proposition process where the mood, the collective mood, the popular sentiment of Californians can be measured in these propositions where they turn out to vote. In the Arellano book, we saw the place of Prop 187 in Gustavo's own political awareness and consciousness when there was this proposition on the ballot in the early 1990s that was designed to foreclose public education and public services to illegal immigrants. Say, you might be here, you might be part of our economy and society, our neighbors, our coworkers, but you're not one of us. So that's an indication that we have seen earlier in the readings regarding the way in which propositions, because they're about popular sentiment, really reveal elements of California history and that ongoing debate as to who is one of us. Another such example is Prop 14. Prop 14 appeared on the ballot in response to the Rumford Act, and it was designed to overturn that law passed by the California state legislature that forbid racial discrimination. The Rumford Act was a civil rights achievement. It was a law passed by the California state legislature that said you cannot discriminate based on race in housing. It demonstrates, as we said, how California was in the vanguard of that effort. But landlords, homeowners in California objected to that. They wanted to preserve the right to discriminate based on race. Efforts by trade groups like the California Real Estate Association to get such a proposition on the ballot ultimately were successful. And Prop 14 in 1964 appeared on the California voter ballot by which California voters were asked whether or not they wanted to overturn the Rumford Act. And it passed overwhelmingly by a 2-to-1 margin as white California voters showed up and voted to preserve the right to discriminate based on race. So here is a really telling, revealing moment in California history. We have seen in previous slides here, whether it's Mendez, whether it's the Rumford Act, whether it's the Civil Rights Act of 1959, there's all this evidence that we've now seen here in this lecture about how California seems like it's on the vanguard. It's in the forefront of really progressive efforts here to dismantle segregation, to reverse trends that prevailed in the early 20th century that foreclosed equality to racial and religious minorities. But then there's this backlash that once again brings us to a mindful status, an awareness of how this question of who is a Californian is contested, whether it's the Progressive Era, the Civil Rights Era, or, as we saw in the Arellano book, much later in the late 20th century in the controversies that surrounded Prop 187. The Proposition 14 here, passed overwhelmingly. And so it briefly allowed, once again, segregation based on race. And so racial minorities who had hoped to be free to now live and therefore learn where they wanted were denied that when California voters said, we want to preserve the right to segregate based on race. And this was ruinous in many ways to racial minorities because, of course, it limited their housing opportunities. It cut them off from opportunities to build equity and wealth by owning those prized suburban homes, send their kids to local public schools, as well as the symbolic statement that you might be here, you might be part of our economy, you may have sacrificed and served in World War II, but you're not one of us. Now later, in 1966, the California State Supreme Court will strike down Prop 14, just as it will later strike down Prop 187. So it was only briefly enforced and eventually is overturned. And so Prop 14 is not the law of the land today. As we'll talk about later, as indicated in the Ariano book, Prop 187 faces a very similar fate. That though it was enacted by California voters, it will be ruled unconstitutional under the California state constitution. So in May of 1966, the California Supreme Court strikes down Prop 14. But that doesn't end the debate, because there's this sentiment in California that the will of the people has been thwarted, that we voted in 1964 to support Prop 14. And then here come these judges that deny that will and reestablish fair housing, what the Rumford Act sought to advance. So we may see this again as a civil rights victory, that the California State Supreme Court stood up for the cause of equality, civil rights. But because the proposition that passed was a product of popular sentiment, you can see this really again, rather than an achievement or advancement, but part of a field of contest, where yes, justices in Sacramento are ruling in a way that deems the decision, the proposition, unconstitutional, but because most Californians agreed with it and supported it, it really reveals how this issue of who is a Californian is in contest at this time. Okay, so with this contest that we see in the drama that plays out between the Rumford Act and then Prop 14, we have now a context to understand one signal event in the story of race, civil rights, and who is a Californian in the post-World War II period, namely the Watts riots, which break out in Los Angeles in 1965. And this event, of course, is at the heart, the center of the book we're reading at this point in the class, Nina Revoir's novel, The Watts, Southland, where the Watts riots is pivotal to the flashbacks and the plot points connecting the two time periods examined in the novel. Watts riots, a key signal event in American history, still studied, still debated because of its richness and importance in the story of civil rights. But here, because of now what we've learned regarding the Rumford Act and Prop 14, we have sort of a sense of context for what will ultimately flare into this signal event. The Watts riots, or the Watts insurrection, probably is a better term. That's a term that's used in the Revoir novel. African Americans who had come to California in World War II had come to sacrifice and serve for their nation. They were vital to the California economy. They were part of the labor, the boom period. But they found themselves subject to residential segregation, confined to certain parts of cities like Watts. It wasn't as if every African American who moved to Los Angeles to serve in the war effort or to work in the wartime industry said, hey, I'm going to live in Watts. It was one of the few places in Los Angeles where they could live, owing to the residential segregation. There was hope for that being remedied with Rumford Act. But then you get Prop 14, where California voters say, no, we don't want African Americans moving from Watts into the white-only enclaves that developed. So African Americans found themselves confined to places like Watts, areas where certain economic opportunities, educational opportunities were limited. With Prop 14, the effort to move to other parts of the city were thwarted. And because Watts was an area where African Americans were concentrated owing to law strictures, it was heavily policed by an almost all-white LAPD force. And the catalyst for the Watts insurrection, the Watts riots that began in the summer of 1965, in August of 1965, are connected to that element of discrimination and racism. The all-white LAPD force often abusing the African-American population concentrated by law through segregation in Watts. Though what really sparked the Watts insurrection was this sense of anger, grievance that came with segregation, being locked in an economically and educationally deprived part of the city. The spark that led to the Watts insurrection, that ultimately triggered all of those intense grievances, long-standing grievances, was the roughing up of some African American women by the LAPD. LAPD pulled over a motorist, and they manhandled this African American woman, and that was really the last straw, where African Americans took to the streets and protested the racism and discrimination that locked them into certain parts of Los Angeles, cutting them off from a lot of economic and educational opportunities. And then once captive there, once subject to that process of captivity that came with residential segregation, they were roughed up, beaten, abused by the LAPD. And so you had this major event, Watts insurrection, Watts riots, that lasted for days. Eventually, California National Guard has to be called in to restore order in that part of Los Angeles. Dozens died, millions of dollars in damages. And so one way to think about the Watts riots is as a manifestation of grievance, anger among African Americans who are subject to this backlash against the Rumford Act and the effort to continue to confine them to certain parts of California cities, namely here Los Angeles. It's also an outgrowth of racism and discrimination at the hands of an LAPD that often brutalized the African American population. But another consequence of the Watts riots was it often deepened those prejudices that undergirded segregation and racism. Because when whites saw this on TV, they said, oh, those African Americans, they're violent, they're engaging in lawlessness, that what we need is more cops on the streets. And so, though this signal event really speaks to the frustration, anger, legitimate grievances of African Americans who were subject to police brutality, subject to residential segregation, who had been told emphatically in Prop 14, you might live in California, you might be part of our society and economy, but you're not an equal member, and we reserve the right to discriminate against you. When the event occurs, it often deepens racial prejudices by whites who remain unsympathetic to the true grievances of African Americans and watch this on their TV and see them, those protesting in the streets, as lawless and needing more police discipline. So the Watts riot is a flashpoint event that speaks to the grievances of Californians, African Americans, but also proved pivotal in deepening the racial prejudices that led to this moment. Alrighty, having spoken about the experience of African Americans in California in the post-World War II period and their role in the debates and efforts of civil rights, let's now talk about some other racial minorities within California in the post-World War II period and their role in the civil rights efforts here within California at this time. Now, we saw and discussed in our lecture on World War II about how with the Zoot Suit riots and the Sleepy Lagoon trial, Latinos were subject to a great deal of discrimination during the World War II period. But they had sacrificed and served in the war effort. They had been more fully integrated into the California economy, particularly with the Bracero program as well as the wartime industry. They had served in the U.S. Army in units that were segregated based on race that excluded African Americans but allowed Latinos to serve side by side with white soldiers. The segregation that prevailed in the U.S. military through World War II segregated African Americans from white troops, but Latino troops often served side by side with whites. And a lot of this was commemorated in Hollywood films that represented this multiracial, multi-ethnic fighting force that included not just whites, but Latinos. And so a lot of the Hollywood pageantry surrounding World War II represented this vision of America as much more generously minded in regards to race, as visible in our fighting force in units that integrated Latinos with whites. So Latinos had sacrificed and served in World War II. They had prospered to some extent based on the wartime economy, but they faced still a great deal of racism and segregation in the World War II era and post-World War II era, as we've seen with things like the Zoot Suit riots and the Sleepy Lagoon trial. By the 1960s, Latinos were increasingly active in parts of the California economy beyond agriculture, living in cities, working in factories, part of the boom era within California, tied to things like the aerospace industry, the defense industry. In California, after World War II, there's a great deal of spending on the defense industry during the Cold War, where we were building missiles to confront the Soviet Union. There was, of course, a space race as part of the Cold War. And places here in Los Angeles like Downey became epicenters for a lot of research and construction involved in the space race, building rockets that eventually would go to the moon and to space. And so Latinos found employment in an urban industrial California economy, in cities driven by the defense industry, driven by a great boom period that came with some of the consequences of massive defense spending, construction, manufacturing. And so the demography, population of Latinos within California shifts in the 1960s to become increasingly urban, not just exclusively part of the agricultural economy as had been seen in the early 20th century and through World War II with the Bracero program. But that caused a lot of frustration because as Latinos began to advance economically and find good paying factory jobs amidst the boom era of the post-World War II period, they still saw their incomes struggle to compete with whites. For Latino immigrants who were still Spanish speaking and were not able, therefore, to obtain a lot of the jobs that required fluency in English, they found their economic earnings ambitions thwarted. And so this was a time of great gains, but also a lot of frustration that Latinos suffered from higher unemployment rates, less family income, less family wealth than whites, even though they were participating in the same economic boom era here in California. In the 1960s, there's a greater and greater awareness, understanding of the Mexican-American experience in California, as in the 1960s, there were a number of advocacy and civil rights groups formed to speak for Latinos, Mexican Americans, and advocate for greater opportunities, equality in education and employment, speaking to those frustrations that came with many Latinos who felt they were still left behind in the post-World War II economic boom era of California. In the 1960s, you had the birth of La Raza, a student protest movement that again advocated for greater educational opportunities for Latinos. The word Chicano was coined in the 1960s to speak to the unique experience of Mexican Americans, particularly here in California. So just as there's this brimming civil rights movement in regards to African Americans here in California and around the nation in the 1960s, there's also this brimming in development Chicano or Latino civil rights movement. And that comes out of the greater visibility, prominence, importance of Latinos in California as they came as immigrants, as they were vital to the economic boom of California after World War II, but a frustration that they remained in many ways second-class citizens, unequal, subject to discrimination. They bore the legacies of a lot of discrimination that limited their advance in the economy and in education, and a lack of political power as well. Though many cities in California had sizable Latino populations, Latinos were very underrepresented in relation to their place within the population within California politics. There are few exceptions to this. Edward Roybal was elected to the LA City Council, a Latino politician representing majority Latino parts of Los Angeles. And he would go on to be ultimately a U.S. congressman elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in the 1960s. But his prominence as a key Latino politician in California was dwarfed by the way in which California politics continued to be dominated by whites, even though Latinos were a rising part of the California society and economy. By 1982, there were only 3 state senators of Latino descent and only 4 members in the California State Assembly. So this too is a key factor in the story of Latino civil rights. That Latinos were part of California, they were key contributors, as we have seen in this class, going back to some of our early lectures, as we read about in the Arellano book. Latinos are vital to the story of California in the 20th century as key figures in the development of California cultures, the California economy, a key source of labor. As you read about in the Arellano book, the modern Orange County was made by Latinos who came and deeply influenced Orange County in a variety of ways. And yet, they weren't visible in areas of prominence and power, in institutions of authority, in the university system, in key professions, and in politics. And that disconnect between their centrality, importance to California, and their access to institutions of power led to civil rights efforts in the post-World War II period. And the man most associated with this Latino civil rights, and a man who would be extremely active here in California in raising the visibility of Latinos as well as granting them access to key institutions of power, was Cesar Chavez. Cesar Chavez was born the son of migrant workers. He saw in his parents' struggle to advance economically the ways in which the major growers, the billionaires who controlled agribusiness, had conspired to thwart unionization among migrant workers so that they could press for higher wages, better working and living conditions, and a chance at the California dream. So Chavez made that his concern, achieving unionization for these key laborers in the California economy, whose labor had made California so prosperous, granting them a chance to come together and unionize, speak with one voice, and work for higher wages, better working conditions, a place within the California dream. So again, we are once again returning to these macro themes in the class about who is a Californian, who has a rightful claim to that vision of a California dream that so crystallizes in the 20th century. Chavez said that by denying farm workers, most of them Asian American and Latino, the right to unionize, we were denying basic liberties and rights to these Californians, these Americans, namely freedom of assembly, the right of like-minded people to come together and advocate for their best interests, freedom of speech. And so he worked with Dolores Huerta, and in 1962 formed the very first effort to unionize farm workers, most of them here in the Southwest, most of them here in California, the National Farm Workers Association, arguing that these farm workers have a right to freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, to advocate for their place within the California dream. In 1965, he helped to launch a boycott against the major grape growers, again, the large landowners who controlled agribusiness in California. He launched a boycott against grape growers, hoping to force these growers to recognize the right of farm workers, most of them Latino, but also Asian Americans, particularly Filipino Americans, who are a big part of Chavez's coalition. Now, again, tack back to what we talked about early in the class. Think about what you read in the Arellano book. Here were groups who had long been subject to persecution, racism, race riots, and as part of that, a very deliberate effort to deny them the right to unionize. Remember, in the Arellano book, Gustavo talks a lot about the 1936 Citrus War here in Orange County, where police departments in Brea and other parts of Orange County crushed efforts by farm workers to unionize. They went in and used violent, coercive means to force people back onto the job so that their labor could continue to advance this billion-dollar industry in Orange County, the citrus industry. and then in doing so denying them the right to unionize, strike, and demand higher wages. So we have seen both in lecture and in the readings the way in which Latinos, Asian Americans, so vital to the development of California, had been subject to a variety of means, including coercive violent means, to deny them the right to unionize, to advocate for their rightful place within the California dream. Chavez was hoping to remedy that here in a post-World War II period where the prospects of greater inclusion, equality, civil rights seemed to be so possible. So in 1965, he partners with Filipino Americans, farm workers, who, as we saw in previous lectures, had also been subject to a variety of forms of repression, violence, and discrimination. They worked to put pressure on the major grape growers here in California by launching this boycott, appealing to Californians. Don't buy grapes until the billionaire grape growers recognize the right of these Californians to form a union, to enjoy these basic rights that any Californian and any American should be guaranteed: freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, to demand their place within the prosperity of a post-World War II California. What did they want? Higher wages, better working conditions, a chance to buy a home, send their kids to college, live that California and with it American dream. And so it's very common here in California in the late 60s, early 70s, when Chavez was using this strategy of boycotts, to see people wearing t-shirts that said boycott grapes, or to see posters sympathetic to this effort that said boycott grapes. What Chavez was doing, along with Huerta and other key union organizers, was appealing directly to California consumers. When you're in the grocery store and you see those big juicy grapes beckoning to you, what do? Do you put them in your cart, buy those grapes, and side with the billionaire growers who are trying to deny California citizens, your fellow Californians, this right to enjoy basic liberties? Or do you refuse to buy grapes, deny those profits to the growers so that they have no choice but to recognize the right of these Californians to enjoy basic civil liberties and civil rights? In 1966, the strike ends when some growers began to recognize the right of Chavez and the laborers he represented to form a union. And so, emboldened, he forms a nationwide union, the United Farm Workers, which seeks to unionize farm workers around the country and therefore negotiate with landowners, growers, higher wages, better working conditions, a chance to indeed enjoy greater economic prosperity and liberty. Chavez, though, elicited a backlash from a growing conservative movement that is also part of the story of post-World War II California. There are a number of social movements that develop here in California after World War II. One is the one we're describing here in this lecture, civil rights. We've seen it with African Americans. We're seeing it now with Latinos. In a moment, we'll pivot and talk about Asian Americans. The 1950s, 1960s, 1970s here in California was a time of burgeoning civil rights movements. Later in the class, we'll talk about Native Americans and Red Power and the occupation of Alcatraz Island here in California as a key element in the story of civil rights. So part of the story of what's going on in California in the post-World War II period is the rise of civil rights, the greater advocacy, visibility of people who had long been persecuted, discriminated to demand their place within California and the larger nation. But as we also read about in the Arellano book, there's another social movement developing right here in California. There's often a backlash to or a countervailing force to civil rights, the modern conservative movement, which begins here in Orange County, led by prominent Republican politicians, donors and boosters like Carl Karcher, the head of Carl's Jr., and an evangelical movement, a born-again Christian movement led by prominent California ministers like Robert Schuller here in Orange County. And so California is an interesting place in the post-World War II period because there's this sort of jousting of different social movements. One, civil rights, the other, the modern conservative movement. And prominent conservatives here in California, or those who owe their origins to California state politics, were very critical of what Chavez was doing. When Cesar Chavez was so active here in California advocating for the rights of Latino farm workers, the governor of California was Ronald Reagan, elected in 1966. Ronald Reagan was governor of California and really one of the key leading figures in the modern conservative movement. He will go on to be elected President of the United States in 1980 and is often championed as this lion of modern American conservatism. President of the United States in the late 60s, having been elected in 1968, was Richard Nixon, conservative, Republican, from Orange County, born in Yorba Linda. So California is a hotbed of civil rights, but it's also a hotbed of this modern conservative movement, which was in many ways born here. Features prominent Californians like Reagan and Nixon as its key leading figures. And Reagan was very condemnatory of Chavez. He called him a communist because he seemed to be threatening the capitalist, consumerist economy by urging you to boycott, by turning Californians against big business in that way. Richard Nixon, also very critical of Chavez. So we rightfully see Chavez as a key figure in modern California history, and today he's often championed as this great figure in the story of Latino civil rights. California has a state holiday dedicated to Cesar Chavez, but he was very controversial and condemned by very prominent conservatives here within California. It really speaks to, again, these kind of contests, the jousting between these different social movements. Nevertheless, Chavez becomes the face of the growing visibility of Latinos within California and the nation. The civil rights era was a time of black power, with African Americans increasingly calling for an equal place within society, speaking about their experience, advocating for black pride in one's African American heritage. As we'll talk about in a separate lecture soon, the 1960s, the civil rights era, was a time of red power, Native American advocacy, and it was a time of brown power, where terms like Chicano and Latino became part of our common parlance, where we were urged to think about the place of these people who had long been excluded, marginalized, subject to repression in all the ways that we've documented here in this class, from the Citrus War to the Zoot Suit riots to the Bracero program, all the way in which they were outsiders within, all the ways in which they were part of California but still excluded. From that comes this advocacy that Chavez really seems to symbolize as he becomes the face of that larger movement. But ultimately he prevailed. His strategy of boycotts proved to be very successful. Many Californians rallied around this effort that was about basic civil rights, the right of people to assemble, speak out, and pursue their economic ambitions to be able to access that California dream. In July of 1970, the large grape growers, under pressure from the boycott campaign and the efforts of Chavez, ultimately agreed to recognize this union, the United Farm Workers, and grant concessions to these laborers who simply wanted higher wages, better working conditions, a chance at the California dream. And with that, they could buy a house in the suburbs. They could send their kids to Cal State Fullerton or UC Riverside or the other institutions that had been previously foreclosed to people. Latinos could vault into the middle class here in California if they could enjoy the fruits that came from a good-paying union job. So Chavez, a key figure here in California as part of this effort of Latino civil rights. Let's now talk about Asian Americans and how in the post-World War II period, a lot of the forces of exclusion that we saw prior to World War II in the early 20th century are also under attack by Asian Americans seeking to reverse those trends of discrimination and claim their place within the California community. In 1952, finally, that California alien land law that was established in the progressive era in the early 20th century is finally struck down, so that Asian Americans here in California can finally own and rent land. We saw how After Pearl Harbor, there was intense anti-Japanese sentiment here in California, and the story of internment. Well, by the 50s and 60s, a lot of that anti-Japanese sentiment had ebbed because the war was over, and in the Cold War, in the 50s and 60s, Japan had become our ally. The United States worked hard after World War II to develop an alliance with Japan as part of a bulwark against the advance of communism in Asia. 1949, China goes communist. And with it, the United States is very alarmed about the potential of communists creeping into parts of Asia. This is what eventually will lead to things like the American War in Vietnam. And as a bulwark against communism, we allied with Japan. So Japan was our ally in the 50s and 60s. And with it came, again, a decrease, not an end, but a decrease to anti-Japanese sentiment. The China's Exclusion Act that had forbidden immigration from China since the 1880s was repealed in 1943 during World War II when we were allied with China. Japan invaded China in 1937, sparking that side, the Pacific side of World War II. And before Pearl Harbor, we helped the Chinese in their resistance to the Japanese occupation through arms sales and lend-lease aid. After Pearl Harbor, when we entered the war against Japan, we more intently helped the Chinese as we sought to roll back the gains made by Japan through Asia. So China was our ally in World War II before China went communist in 1949. So in 1943, amidst that era of World War II where China was our ally, we ended the Chinese Exclusion Act so that Chinese refugees fleeing Japanese occupation, those who had worked against the Japanese occupation, could come to the United States as immigrants. And then in 1965, we passed the Hart-Celler Act, which completely remakes our immigration laws and opens our borders to people who for decades had been excluded, deemed ineligible for citizenship and immigration. The Chinese Exclusion Act, the Gentleman's Agreement of 1907, forbid immigration from Japan and China. 1924 Johnson-Reed Act closed off immigration from most of the world. In 1924, we passed the Johnson-Reed Act on a federal level, nationwide, as all immigration policy comes from the federal government, that effectively cut off immigration from most of the world, except for the Western Hemisphere. So that's why you get the Bracero program and Filipino immigration, because the Philippines was still an American colony in 1924. In 1965, we end that 1924 Act with the Hart-Celler Act, which opens our borders anew. And now people from around the world, particularly from Asia, who had been denied a chance to immigrate, will come. And we'll talk a lot about this, particularly in the final book we'll read for American Studies 395. The story, the murder of Latasha Harlins, and a key part of that is the story of Korean immigration to California, to Los Angeles after 1965. So in 1965, Asians, including Japanese, Chinese, Koreans, can come without restrictions. And they settle in California. Those who come as immigrants tend to be people with an education and a wealth that allows them to emigrate, to leave Korea, Japan, after 1965 involves having the means to do so. And so the people who tend to come are people with some wealth and education, and then their children are born here in California. And so what we see is the rise of Asian Americans, increasingly visible in business, in politics, in the professions, in education, like we have seen in the story of Latinos making gains into institutions of power and authority that they had been previously denied. In 1974, March Fong Yu is elected Secretary of State here in California and will be reelected 4 times into the 1980s, demonstrative of gains that Asian Americans were making here in California in institutions of power like state politics. In 1976, S.I. Hayakawa, a Japanese American, was the first Californian of Japanese descent to be elected to the U.S. Senate, not the state Senate, the U.S. Senate. So in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, owing to all these changes here, civil rights, the decline of a lot of anti-Asian sentiment, a 1965 immigration law that allowed for more Asian immigration to California, there are these demographic changes and the greater visibility, prominence, and success of Asian Americans, Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, a huge influx of Filipino Americans after World War II. Because even before we revised our 1965 immigration laws and allowed for immigration from most of the world now, the Philippines, even prior to that, had been permitted immigration to the United States because of the close connection between the U.S. and the Philippines during World War II. When planes are bombing Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, at the exact same moment on the other side of the Pacific, the Japanese are attacking the Philippines, which in 1941 was still an American possession. And they would occupy the Philippines during World War II. And what happens is that Americans and Filipinos fight against that occupation, and you get this really intense and horrific, brutal guerrilla war against the Japanese occupation, where Americans and Filipinos were fighting side by side. Creates a lot of fondness here in the United States for Filipinos. We talked about how earlier in the 20th century, Filipinos had been subject to a great deal of racism, discrimination, race riots like the Watsonville riots. But in World War II, Californians and Americans at large were encouraged to feel a deep connection to Filipinos because we're fighting together against a common enemy, against the Japanese. There are posters produced by the U.S. government saluting the fighting Filipinos. Hollywood made movies in the 1940s during World War II that celebrated the resistance that came with this partnership between American and Filipinos fighting against the Japanese. We endured similar hardships like the Bataan Death March, where when the Japanese occupied the Philippines, they forced Americans and Filipinos through this march in the heat and humidity of Luzon, where many starved, were dehydrated, or outright killed. And then later that was commemorated in Hollywood films like Bataan and Back to Bataan. So attitudes changed towards Filipinos, and they came in even before the 1965 law was established because there was this key immigration exception, as they were so vital to our war effort, this kinship and connection that developed as we fought against the Japanese together. And Filipinos who came after World War II continued to work in agriculture and some of the industries we saw earlier where Filipinos had worked here in California, fishing, canneries, agriculture. But increasingly they also worked in the professions. And there was a very active effort to recruit Filipinos who had been educated in the Philippines in professions like medicine to come to California and fill jobs in nursing and other key professions. So it's now a story of changing places for Filipino Americans within the California economy of the post-World War II period. By 1980, Filipino Americans are the largest Asian American group in California and in the nation. Of course, a lot of it has to do with the history that we've seen in previous lectures between the U.S. and the Philippines. After 1965, again, parts of Asia that had been closed off as sources of immigration since 1924, or even prior with the Chinese Exclusion Act and Gentlemen's Agreement, were now open. And one of the areas of Asia that would, along with Japan and the Philippines, become a key source of immigration to California was Korea. Korea, of course, was a site of strife after World War II with the Korean War, with the communist takeover of the North. And so there were many seeking to flee Korea and come to the United States. And after 1965, they could, because now they were eligible to come as immigrants. And so Koreans come. Those who come tend to be people, again, with the means to come, and they often establish businesses here. And as we'll see later in the class, that's the story of the Du family, who are Korean immigrants who come to Los Angeles After 65, they set up a couple of businesses here in California, and then their fortunes and lives intersect with the tragedy of Latasha Harlins, leading to the LA riots of the 1990s. So the experience of Korean immigrants, and in particular as exemplified by one family, the Du family, will be a big part of the final book we'll read in this class, which is all about the story of the LA riots of 1992. And that's part of, again, a larger story of Korean Americans coming in large numbers to California after 1965. And then you have further upheavals in Asia as a result of the American war in Vietnam and the expanding of the bombing to nations like Laos and Cambodia, unsettling those regions, leading to the rise of brutal repressive dictatorships like the Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia, which creates a refugee crisis, a great effort to flee these areas of strife, repression. And so, beginning in the 1970s, you get this huge influx of immigrants from Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. There's an effort by the U.S. government to relocate allies of the United States that had fought with us in the American war in Vietnam against communist forces, like the Hmong, which was an ethnic minority in Vietnam that sided with the Americans. And when the Americans pull out in 1975, there's this fear that the Hmong are going to be attacked because they would be seen as traitors who side with the Americans. And so there's a lot of efforts to resettle them. There's a refugee program in the 70s that relocates Vietnamese, many of whom were allies of the United States, to the United States. And California would be one of the key centers of settlement for these refugees. And again, we read about this in the Ariano book, the rise of, in particular, Vietnamese Americans in Orange County, in places like Westminster, in those areas of South Orange County that today host sections we call Little Saigon. The prominence of Cambodian and Laotian, also Americans in Orange County and throughout the state, come from the way in which we expanded the bombing and began to bomb those countries, created chaos in those nations. And so you get this large influx of immigrants from that area. And most of them come to California. Most of the refugees who were fleeing Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia in the chaos, unrest, strife engendered by U.S. foreign policy, most of those who fled Southeast Asia and those countries came here to California. So that too is part of the changing demography and greater visibility of Asian Americans within California. They were seeking as well a chance at the American or California dream, fleeing these areas that were subject to repression, strife, civil war, bloodshed, and coming to participate in the California economy and society, all part of a way in which, as we've seen with African Americans and Latinos prior, California was becoming increasingly diverse and heterogeneous in the post-World War II period. So in this lecture, we've examined the way in which we can understand one cardinal development in American history of the post-World War II period, the modern civil rights movement, through the lens of California. We've documented how California was in the vanguard of the civil rights efforts of this period. Well before legislation, Supreme Court rulings on a federal level will advance the cause of civil rights, you have legislation and Supreme Court rulings here in California that work towards that end of ending segregation and creating true equality. Mendez versus Westminster, 1959 Civil Rights Act. So we've seen here how California is in the vanguard as well as the epicenter of this key development in American history. A big part of the theme in this class is how California really sets the tone for larger trends that define American history in the 20th century. And so we've seen that here in this lecture, but we've also seen how those changes come with backlashes, where some things change, but others do not. We saw again in the Watts insurrection, frustration among African Americans that they remain subject to discrimination, racism, police brutality, and also remain denied many of the economic opportunities that came with the California dream, or continue to suffer from strictures and rules established prior that foreclose them opportunities to build wealth and access education. So the story of California civil rights isn't solely a triumphalist narrative. It isn't really solely a story of, wow, things are getting better, more diverse, more generous, more equal, because many racial divides remain. It's hard to reverse the consequences of what we saw earlier in the class, decades and decades and decades of discrimination. You don't end that with one act of legislation or one Supreme Court ruling. So there are ways in which many Californians of racial minorities here in California remain separate and unequal. And as well, there's this growing backlash to civil rights that we've seen in a modern conservative movement that we've already read about in developments like Prop 187. We saw it here with Prop 14 and the repeal of the Rumford Act. So there's a backlash to civil rights. There's this tension between different visions of who is a Californian. California, in some ways, is at the epicenter of the things that we so associate with the 60s: civil rights, feminism, gay rights. This is the part of the country so associated with the counterculture. You see Berkeley, the free speech movement, student protests. But it's also the California of Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon, a growing conservative movement, many of the developments we read about in the Ariano book, and we'll encounter in lecture here as we go forward and learn more about things like Prop 187, the rise of a modern conservative movement, the backlash against black power, brown power, red power. So we've seen some major changes in the post-World War II period with California civil rights, the greater visibility, the greater advocacy of people of color, demanding greater equality, a chance of the California dream. But this question of who is a Californian remains contested, because as much as California is the epicenter of key movements like civil rights and feminism and gay rights and the counterculture, it's also very indicative of other trends in the 1960s, other social movements like a conservative movement, which also began here in California. So though this is a moment for thinking differently about race and citizenship here in California, it's also another beat in the longer rhythm we trace here in American Studies 395 of how this question of who is a Californian who deserves access to the California dream is a subject of great contention, because California is both an epicenter of civil rights, a more heterogeneous, generous vision of California and America. It's also an epicenter of a backlash against that among many other Californians who have a vision of California that's very different. California may be a center of civil rights, but it's also the place of white flight, Disneyland and its vision of who is really an American or what constitutes the American vision, and a modern conservative movement that often sought to counter efforts by feminists, racial minorities, key figures in those social movements of this period. So the point here is great change in regards to civil rights in this period. But what doesn't change is that the issue of who is a Californian, what defines the California dream, remains